Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and with Brad and Chris, two longtime friends and early to crypto. We're talking about recent innovations in payments. We're going to focus the conversation on payments, but I thought it'd be useful to kick us off, and Chris, I'll turn to you, to just go back to the early days of XRP, Ripple, and I want to walk through a quick kind of evolution of thinking of how you thought about payments from those early days and how you're thinking about them now, and the two of you can tag team on that one. But over to you, Chris.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having us today. Sorry I can't be there in person, but great to see you both. So yeah, this is now going on about 12 years, since the earliest days of digital assets. Bitcoin had sort of been out there, but not well known at that time. I don't know, I think it may have been trading for $1 at that time. But there was a group of very, very smart cryptographers who I got involved with, who saw the innovation of Bitcoin, were super excited about it because it was the first decentralized currency that we've ever had in the world. But we're bothered by some of the aspects of it that we continue to see today, the enormous use of energy it takes to validate transactions. So we thought we could build a better Bitcoin. That was sort of what inspired that team early on. I'd say going back to the earliest days, though, I think it was nothing more than the world should have a non-governmental currency that's online that can reach anywhere on the planet. I don't think it was where we are today, which is really targeting cross-border payments, for example, and payments in general. It was more of a broader idea that it would be a good thing for the world to have a non-governmental currency that wasn't controlled by anybody. And that's sort of where the broadest notion of the industry went, which I think is a very powerful thing, and of course, the foundation of everything else that comes from that.
So it began somewhat philosophically, but it got practical pretty quickly, because I remember Swell 2018, which is, of course, Ripple's annual conference, where you were already talking, the focus there really was this cross-border aspect. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that evolution.
So I think anytime you're building a company and you're trying to catalyze a vision, I mean, Chris has been behind many different kind of seeing around corners and seeing where the markets are going. And I think it's how do you translate that into what do you do tomorrow to bring that to today? And so when you start thinking about enabling an internet of value and some of the decentralized natures of the currency that Chris was talking about, it's how do you get it moving? And the highest friction point, I mean, there's a lot of friction points in payments. There's a reason why FedNow was invested in. There's a reason why a lot of these things have been developed recently. But the highest friction point has been cross-border payments. And I say that friction in terms of cost. I say that friction in terms of speed. I say that friction in terms of error rates. I'm guessing many people in this audience, either professionally or personally, have had the experience of, wait a minute, this has been 2 weeks and I still don't have a credit that I thought I was going to have. And I just recently personally had that experience. So, by using some of the underlying technologies, and for Ripple, it's building upon a digital asset called XRP, really taking some of that friction and making it almost real time, almost free per transaction, and you're moving the error rate down to close to zero, is the opportunity. And if you start with a really high friction place like cross-border payments, we see it potentially propagating into other areas as well. But I do think at the core, and as Chris talked about, Bitcoin at the earliest days, and you go back to the Bitcoin white paper, it was about payments. The challenge is not all crypto has transaction speed and cost that makes sense for payments.
So when you talk about payments, of course, there's a long history of payments that predates even Bitcoin, predates crypto of any kind. And payments were run by institutions, different kinds of institutions. And so you've had a very different strategy, the two of you and Ripple Labs, about thinking through institutional alignment or how you think about institutions versus, I would say, some of the other corners of the crypto community, which are more of the burn it down sentiment, shall we say. And I'm curious how just describe that to me and how you think about institutions and the role you think they play, particularly vis-a-vis crypto and crypto assets.
Maybe I'll start, then I'll pass it over to Chris. But I remember I first got involved in the crypto world in about 2012, and I'd been exposed to Bitcoin. And I always worried that the Achilles heel might be this, as you're describing, this kind of anti-government, anti-bank. And when I first learned about Ripple and Ripple's vision, it was, okay, wait, if you just try to create a parallel infrastructure, you're really never going to impact and have the benefit accrue to the most people if you're always working outside the system. And Ripple's early vision was very much, how do we work with the banks? How do we work with governments? And to some degree, as Sheila certainly knows, and as Chris lived firsthand, that made Ripple very controversial in the crypto community. And even before we got on stage here, Sheila and I were talking about, like, some in crypto, I think, still have this reality distortion field about, hey, the banks don't matter. And even in some cases, the government doesn't matter. I think we have consistently tried to be constructive with governments around the world and, pursuing licensing around the world. There's one notable exception with the SEC here in the United States that we could talk about, but I think it's an important dynamic that if these technologies, which truly can, not just around payments, these are core technologies that can reduce friction and improve the experience for businesses, citizens everywhere. And I mean that very much globally.
Yeah, I would add to that, we talk about an internet of value, and we very much think this is kind of a second internet. It's not data, it's value, as Brad just talked about. But there are some important differences. Remember, the internet of data was pretty much created hand in hand with government, right? It was government, it was universities. So at its core, it sort of already had a much more integrated sort of philosophy. And that was probably very good. Bitcoin, digital assets, completely different story. It was kind of created by renegade libertarians, in the wake of the '08 financial crisis. So it was, by its nature, very anti-government, and that was unfortunate. I think that actually set back the industry, as Brad mentioned, on the road to really scale globally, because you have to be integrated to the financial system. And another thing we have to keep in mind is, with our big social media companies, you always have the First Amendment protecting information and communications. You don't have a First Amendment for financial, value. That's a totally different beast. So I think this is what people in the industry missed, is that fintech and financial services are the technology is intimately related to the compliance and the capital markets. All three of those things have to work together. I think the industry learned that the hard way, and we've tried to be kind of more constructive there. And I think that's generally worked with regulators, again, with the exception, and we can come back to it, of this misguided, broken SEC under Gary Gensler.
So it's interesting. I think they're clearly they are a plethora, a panoply, like a multitude of views and political philosophies that underlie crypto and digital assets. And I think a lot of it, to some extent, determines where you wind up in the market, and to some extent, how big your kind of product market cap is. Who you're able to partner with, what you're able to do, how you're perceived, all of that. And I certainly think crypto as an industry is the least far from monolithic I've ever seen, apart from in the point that you both named, which is views on the SEC. So I'd be remiss, since you both rang the bell, I'd be remiss in not asking, you've had a recent development in your own case, well, not yours personally, but in the company's case. And I'd be curious to maybe give an update on that. And I know there's a lot of misperceptions about what is actually happening, what's being litigated, what's being appealed. Yeah. If you could talk about that too.
So the SEC brought a case against Ripple December 22nd, 2020, so almost 4 years ago, asserting that our sales of XRP to our customers had been sales of unregistered securities. Now, I was kind of joking to Sheila before we got up here. I'd like to believe I'm reasonably intelligent, but I'd never once thought that, maybe XRP is a security, because we're using it as a currency in these cross-border flows. Our customers are, payment companies, whether it's banks, whether it's payment providers, what have you. And their assertion was these are securities, and we're selling unregistered securities. It was a very expensive 3.5-year battle with the SEC. We spent about $150 million on legal bills, and we prevailed. And the conclusion from the federal court was that XRP, quote, in and of itself is not a security. Now, one misunderstanding, so that there's parts of the case the SEC has just recently chose to appeal, and one misunderstanding is the SEC is not appealing whether or not XRP is a security. They've kind of, I think, given up the fight on that. Now, I will just say it is so inefficient to have a government agency saying, we're going to go and litigate every single token. Because really, in the United States, this is kind of a shocking point, I think. In the United States, there are two cryptocurrencies with regulatory clarity: Bitcoin and XRP. And XRP only has it because we fought that fight. It's kind of madness to think we're going to go and litigate every single one based upon use case, based upon, what have you. And so the criticality of, frankly, even events like this where government and private are coming together, but you are seeing movement in at the federal level. There's something passed the House called Fit 21 Act, which I think is constructive. It may be in the final chapters of the lame duck. We'll see something happen in the Senate side. But I think for both Chris and I, it certainly was a very interesting and a challenging experience to get distracted in building this, payments-centric view of where we think the world's going around infrastructure, to be distracted by this. The last thing I'll say about it, and I'm sure Chris has other things to add, it's our business outside the United States has gone very, very well. 95+% of our customers are non-U.S., and since the SEC lawsuit, 75% of our hiring has been non-U.S. And what a sad state of reality that a U.S. company has, that is, actually delivering real use cases around these technologies that, basically can't sell into the U.S. market even now, because U.S. companies are like, well, the SEC is appealing, and they don't understand exactly what the SEC is appealing, but it's a reason to say no, we don't want to fight that fight right now. We'll wait and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just add, very clearly, I think the approach that Gary Gensler pretty much directed, let's just call it who was behind it. Senator Warren, I think, was on a mission. She's literally called this the war on crypto. Was on a mission pretty much to destroy the industry, to hobble the U.S. industry by using regulation by enforcement rather than creating clear rules of the road. And what the industry has always asked for is like, just make the rules clear. Just tell us exactly what those rules are. We want those clear rules, and the industry can thrive. Consumers can be protected. That's not the approach they took, I think, on purpose, because the attacking the industry on these are all securities, it never made any sense. These are not securities. They don't have rights and privileges. The developing teams that made them don't have obligations. It fits the commodity model fundamentally, and I think they know that. But again, I think it was an attack on the industry to hobble it. Now, what was the effect of that? It just empowered a bunch of sketchier, overseas firms like FTX, which turned out to be a total disaster. So net on net, you didn't protect consumers. You hobbled the U.S. You empowered, industries in Singapore, in London. You didn't create any jobs in Ohio, for example. So it didn't make any sense. And, the good news is I think we're at the twilight of Gary Gensler's reign of terror. It's just about over. And I think whoever wins this election, it's going to be a fundamentally different thing.
And I love that we're saying all the words out loud. It's pretty funny. I will tell you, when I took I founded the blockchain team at the World Economic Forum, and I took that job in 2017. And my colleagues in Geneva, I was part of the San Francisco office of the forum, and the Geneva office was like, oh, we've got this thing coming. It didn't have a name quite yet. It wasn't MiCA, Markets and Crypto Assets, this groundbreaking legislation that was coming, that was like comprehensive legislation in Europe. And they're like, well, we're going to get that legislation passed before the U.S. does anything. And I was like, friends, please, when has Europe beaten the U.S. to the punch in terms of landing a business, right? I was so wrong. I could not possibly have been more wrong. And so to have watched that, and behind the scenes, I was, of course, talking to some of those people in that role that I was in, and to see that this many years later, they're in implementation, which is not a fast process in Europe. Let me be very clear. It is a slow, bureaucratic, very, labor-intensive, collaborative, consensus-driven process, to say the least. And here we are, and we can't get a bill through Congress on something that is crucial, is absolutely wild. It's really wild, beyond all my imagination when I took that role 7 years ago. But I'll also say, I think what we were talking about before, the question, you really need to frame this up and understand. The question is not, is crypto going to survive? It is not just surviving, it is thriving in most parts of the world. The question is, what role, if any, will the United States, and most importantly, in my opinion, United States customers and users have in this ecosystem? And how constrained and restricted will they be in using a development that will become more and more commonplace and mainstream all over the world? That to me is the question at hand. It really isn't about the fate of the industry. It's not a fatalistic exercise. It's really about U.S. companies wanting to continue to build in the U.S. and to serve a U.S.-based customer base. So then I think we have to get into a conversation. Well, we can talk about ETFs briefly, but I'd actually rather, before we talk about that, because I think it's less, people kind of understand what that is. I'm curious, I will be curious to get your take on whether you think the resolution of the appeal will lead to an ETF and how you think about ETFs as an institution. Well, let's talk about that actually. First of all, do you think they're connected? And secondly, do you think that the advent of ETFs in general, leaving aside an XRP ETF, but just in general of ETFs, do you think that that is a marker of an evolution? And what do you think that means for how the regulatory environment, particularly prudentials, kind of see these assets, given that they're now being embraced in many ways, some of them, by institutions? Chris, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ETF just represents another step in the evolution of these things going mainstream, right? And that's a good thing. I also think that lends itself to more long-term holding. And these art currencies, they do have a key role in payments, but I think they also are a macro hedge on a world of uncertainty, and particularly in this world where you see governments pretty much all around the world sort of giving up on sort of deficit vigilance, right? So it doesn't matter the party anymore. We sort of lost our minds on deficits. Look, we're all going to have to adjust. There's going to be a price to be paid at some point, but I think that's part of the reason why digital assets, fit into the world very nicely. And no surprise that happened after the '08 crisis. And I think we still have a lot of elements that make people want these assets. So ETFs are a nice way for long-term holding. That's probably more constructive to these markets anyway, right, as long-term holders. And I think it moves away from any notion of hey, this is just speculation. There's clearly speculation in any market. Some of that can be even healthy because it offsets folks that are trying to hedge, as any sort of economist would tell you. But I think it's a good development.
I'll just say I think it's been exciting to watch this is no longer the fringe. It's BlackRock. These are major players that have entered the space. And the Bitcoin ETF, my understanding, is the most successful ETF ever introduced. I think there's $17 billion of inflows. Now, again, just because I can't pass an opportunity to take a pot shot at the SEC, keep in mind they were actually dragged kicking and screaming into the approval of the ETF. A court ordered them to kind of finally, okay, the quote was, "You're being arbitrary and capricious in their implementation of the law." And so the Bitcoin ETF, it's there's clearly a lot of demand, and that has been successful. Interestingly, there were 2 filings around an XRP ETF, and then the next day the SEC announced they're going to appeal parts of the decision, which was, again, I think this doesn't feel like somebody who's trying to work constructively and with the core mission to protect investors.
Well, I want to pivot us to where I want to spend the rest of our time, which is talking about payment rails. Okay, so going back to 2016, 17, there really wasn't the same discussion around. Well, there were discussions about the challenges around payment rails, the challenges around fees, intermediaries, rent seekers, et cetera. But I don't know that a solution had crystallized that early. Maybe by 15, sort of you'd had some of that come together. But I'm curious. I just want to hear how you think about that innovation space, thinking about the rails themselves, leaving aside the assets flowing on those rails. How do you think about the challenges in existing rail systems, the innovation that is needed, and what kind of gets us to a place where the freer flow of this? I mean, regulation obviously is part of it, but there are other things as well. So speak to that.
Yeah, I think, and you've even heard from, I think earlier today, some phenomenal companies and startups, well, bigger than startups, but interesting companies in the payment space. What's interesting to me is that so many of the companies in the space are building or kind of hacking the existing rails and doing things that I'll almost call a little bit unnatural because of the limitation of the rails. Ripple's view has been, well, let's reset the rail. Now, that's harder. It takes longer. But if you can do that, that unlocks a lot of efficiencies. Because if actually transactions are real time and effectively free, it's an unlock for a lot of activity. We're focused cross border, but it's surprising to me that in the year 2024, we still live in a world that we don't have robust clearing mechanisms, and the U.S. is way behind. I mean, not just on the cross border side, but we've been behind, and so I think, like the earliest days of the Internet of Information, this is kind of the Telecom Deregulation Act of '96. it created rules of the road, which were clear. It allowed entrepreneurship. It allowed investors to flow in. And the U.S. has had massive geopolitical benefits from the fact that we are, in the United States, kind of the center of the Internet of Information. I believe blockchain technologies are going to rewire many parts of our financial systems globally. And I mean financial payments. I mean real estate transactions. I mean title settlement. I mean, pick an example. And I think if you can use a blockchain to reduce friction, reduce cost, eventually that's going to happen. And I think the U.S. should want to be part of the heartbeat around that, as opposed to, as Chris described earlier, effectively creating mechanisms that are driving that offshore to sometimes sketchier outcomes.
Yeah, and just to build on that again, going back to what was the major innovation of the internet. Before the internet, we had a bunch of networks, country by country, or phone company by phone company, that didn't interoperate with each other. Right? The internet was just basically a network of networks, and now suddenly the entire world is wired together. And that's sort of the same story of what's happening in the digital asset space. Why is it so hard to move money across border? It's because each country has its own network. There is no network of network until I think you could argue that blockchain and digital assets sort of represent the beginnings of that network of network. And that's why the U.S. should be all over this, and we should be designing rules and regulations and support that make us the world champions, just like we dominate the internet. I think we have to dominate this area because the U.S. is in a great position of basically controlling the world's financial system. You don't want to risk that, and a major move like this technology represents. Look, you could be a bigger winner, or you could start chipping away at that power. Obviously, the choice is very obvious. So we have to get back on track here of supporting American champions and not hobbling them.
Okay, so assuming that we are in favor of more fit for purpose, I'm going to call them rails, okay? And assuming that there are moves by existing players to try to get there are new players trying to get there, we all kind of assuming, this is a big assumption for the room, I know, but let's just go with this for a moment, that we think that's necessary. There are other things that have to happen, right? There are other like UX kinds of unlocks and builds. So what's preventing that from being more attractive? Because there is the regulatory capture kind of element of that. Okay, fine, leaving that aside. There's also just the usability of these things and the sort of optics and the perception around them as well. So maybe speak to that and what's preventing that.
Well, I think having clear rules of the road for all entrepreneurs certainly helps in getting people to say, okay, I'm going to go focus on this piece or that piece. The other thing, and we talked about this a little bit, I do think that the industry that I know I'm representing up here sometimes is doing itself no favors by advocating for things that enable anonymous transactions. And, my view has always been the only way these technologies scale is to make sure they are first and foremost. And Ripple for sure has always been on the front foot around how do we make sure compliance is first. But, you read things that's, okay, DeFi and the enablement of non-KYC transactions, our view has always been, okay, that's dead on arrival. That's not going to work. We need to make sure that the core pieces here meet with basic standards of government regulation because governments aren't going to go away. We actually had Ben Bernanke speak at one of our conferences, Swell, years ago. And I remember one of the things he said is the idea that governments are going to give up control of things like KYC and their money supply, they will roll tanks into the street before they allow that. That was his quote. I remember thinking it was kind of profound. I mean, he's obviously a very interesting, smart guy, but I remember thinking like, yeah, they probably would roll the tanks into the street before they'd let go of that.
Okay, but there are different and better ways of doing that. Okay, there's ways of doing KYC that are older ways, and there's ways of doing KYC and AML that are more, again, fit for purpose. Who needs what information when? And those layers aren't quite built yet. We could talk about ZKPs all day, zero knowledge proofs. Everyone can look it up. We talk about some of the infrastructure layers that I think would enable a robust KYC regime, but would not compromise some of the privacy elements, the need for security and the need for safety, but also allow people what I think is being really, I think, required by consumers now. I wouldn't even say requested, but anybody who would kind of use an alternate system is going to want differential privacy and the ability to do that. So how do you all think about that?
I'll comment real quick on this and Chris can comment further. I mean, Ripple directly does not quote unquote think about that. I think there's a dog barking somewhere back there. I love that.
Everybody's got a view.
The dog has an opinion on this one. Okay, the dog has an idea. Regulated endpoints. So all of our customers, we would not work with someone who isn't, either have banking licensing, what have you. And so you can't have a transaction. I love it. This is the trials and tribulations of a live broadcast. But for Ripple, we are always working with a regulated endpoint, and so all the transactions are KYC verified for AML, what have you, at the endpoint. And when we go, and I spend a fair bit of time talking to central governments around the world, most more constructively than here in the United States, and as soon as they understand that any regulatory features, controls that they want are still absolutely present by virtue of the bank that they regulate in their jurisdiction, they're like, oh, okay, this is just a new rail. And whether it's capital flow controls, whether it's KYC dynamics, AML, OFAC, what have you, that's applied at that endpoint.
Chris, you or the dog have any
further comments on that? Everything you just said. So good job on that.
plus one.
The only thing I would add.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'd add that, one of the other things that we need to work on, it's not just the SEC, but we do have this thing called Operation Choke Point, 2.0, which is really preventing a lot of the industry from working hand in hand with the experts in KYC and AML, the large financial institutions. It's holding that relationship back because for whatever reason, probably, mostly political, those institutions are being told if you deal with this industry, you're going to be under added scrutiny. We have to get past that. And then even once we get past that, I think there's a larger issue here of just how hard it is to get bank charters. There's a report or an article I just read this week. American champions like Stripe and Square, they're having problems with banking relationships. That's holding back some of their services. So we've got to get past that somehow, because that's really not working for this country.
So specifically, I'll just flag again, and we're not going to talk about the election. I think we got almost to the end of time without talking about it, so I'm very proud of myself. But I feel like I had one job. However, these are very U.S. problems, and internationally, we don't have these same problems, right? So why is it, in kind of a very quick summary, that we aren't seeing the conversion in a more broad scale way in other jurisdictions, which includes some major jurisdictions, right? We do have the Singapores and say what you will about the crypto wonderlands of some other countries, but why do you think that is?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a kind of a well-known Silicon Valley expression of it. You always overestimate what's going to happen in 5 years and underestimate what's going to happen in 10 years. And, I don't know where we are exactly. The earliest days of the internet, it took 30 plus years before the browser was invented. We are somewhere around 12, maybe 15 years into the blockchain evolution, not necessarily a revolution. And I think we may be surprised about where we are in, the 5 to 10 year mark. But my experience in life, and I'm no longer young, is if you have a better technology that's, better, faster, stronger, cheaper, eventually people are going to be like, oh, this is a better way to do this. Banks are cautious, payment providers are cautious, governments and regulators are appropriately cautious sometimes. And as Chris has said, like, we want the regulation, we just want clear regulation so that everyone knows how to operate within that.
Yeah, but the other thing I think is super important, we have to recognize, if the U.S. is not on board in a global financial system that they basically control 80% of the system, the U.S. controls, it's on the U.S. dollar, there's just no way that is going to reach its potential. So we've got to get the U.S. completely on board, and we've got to get American innovators dominating this industry before we're really going to see the benefits here.
And I'll just close this out by answering my own question, which is, I think it's two. I think one is what I said before, which is it is a question of where, not whether. And I do think you're going to see a shift in U.S. dominance and dollar dominance over time, over a longer period of time, for sure, if we don't kind of get this right and land the regulatory plane, as I always say here. The second is industry itself has to decide who is our market. Are we trying to go after normal people? Or are we trying to stay with sort of really exceptional, shall we say, I'll use the most polite term I can think of, exceptional individuals who maybe have a different perception of what is and should be possible. And once we solve those two things, I think it's going to be, sky's the limit. Well, thanks so much to Brad and Chris and to Jalapa for having us today.